we don't give doctors enough credit for how hard it is really working in that environment and how much of it is run on goodwill, basically.
Welcome back to 40-Minute Mentor, the podcast on a mission to raise aspirations and inspire the next generation of category-defining founders, all in just 40 minutes. Today, we're joined by Dr Dupe Burgess, founder and CEO of Bloomful, the health tech on a mission to close the gender health gap and improve the access to gynae care for women globally. Prior to building Bloomful, Dupe worked as a medical doctor for 8 years and then transitioned into strategy consulting at BCG. Since launching Bloomful in 2021, Dupe and the team have been on an incredibly successful journey, including reaching over 4,000 women with their first triage tool in just a few weeks. Dupe and the team have also received equity-free funding from Google and KPMG and won an award for Most Promising Small Business. I've had the real pleasure of meeting Dupe in person at a founders event and have seen her success from afar, and I'm super excited to dive into the Bloomful journey today. So thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you here. How are you?
I'm really good, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here.
The pleasure is all mine. We'll get you warmed up. I think it's a good place to start with a few quick-fire questions, as we always like to. So please finish the following sentences after me. Question 1. Success means to me...
being happy and healthy and fulfilled.
Yes, that is success, isn't it? That is success. I think sometimes we...
In a nutshell.
Yeah, it really is that simple. Love it. And the best day in my career to date was when?
Yeah, I've had a few. I have to say, I was thinking about this and it was hard to choose just one because there are probably 3 or 4 that really stand out in my mind. But graduation, believe it or not, all those years ago, I literally remember looking for my exam number down the board and seeing the pass, and I was like, yes. So graduating definitely is up there, but also being offered my job at BCG was a really standout moment. That was I was so happy to make that transition. So those are probably the two that stand out in my mind.
Love that. Yeah, what a firm to work at. We'll come on to that in a minute. One piece of advice I'd give to my younger self is...
don't worry so much. Stop worrying about every little thing and just try and enjoy things a bit more and take joy out of things, because time does march on very quickly and you don't know what you've got till it's gone, basically.
Very wise words. My mum is the ultimate warrior. I don't know if she'd appreciate me saying this, but I've definitely inherited that. I definitely have worries, but you're so right. Time flies and sometimes you just got to crack on and focus on that.
And you forget.
Yeah, exactly. So true. Finally, my biggest failure to date is...
I think one failure is probably not leaving medicine earlier, actually. When I look back, I think there was probably good few years where I knew it wasn't the right career for me, where I didn't make the transition for one reason or another, which, I'm happy to talk about in this later in the chat. But yeah, I think not making that transition earlier, whether or not it would have made any difference to life, who knows? But I think I made it just about the right time, but I wish I'd maybe shaved off a couple of years. And is that a failure? I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't think it is, but it's interesting when we all reflect back on our careers, there are definitely, most people that come on this podcast, there's something that they wish they'd have done a little bit sooner, or a role that was making them miserable that they wish they'd have kind of just taken the plunge earlier, particularly when it comes to entrepreneurial ideas, because we all know it takes a long time to get something off the ground and to have the success and fulfill the potential. So I guess the sooner you can get going on it, the better in many ways. But then again, experience can help us all become better leaders and entrepreneurs. So, maybe this was just the path it was meant to be. Well, thank you for sharing that. Dupe, really can't wait to dig into your story. But before we dive into all things Bloomful, do you mind sharing a bit about your upbringing? What was your childhood like? Did you always want to be a doctor? What were your early career ambitions?
I always think that's the question that doctors always get asked. Did you always want to be a doctor? It's such a funny one. Yeah, I'm happy to share a bit more about my upbringing for sure. So my mum and dad arrived in the UK from Nigeria in the early 80s, and both very well educated. My dad and mum actually met at University of Lagos. My dad was there studying medicine, so he is a doctor. My mum was doing her master's in English literature. So they kind of met and fell in love and decided to move to the UK, better opportunities, great place to bring up kids. And so they moved over here, and I'm one of 4 children. So I'm the second of 4 kids, and we were raised in Bedfordshire. So, pretty normal upbringing, fairly happy. I went to like a private girls' school in Bedford, and I had a great time at school. I've got really happy memories of that time. And I think one of my earliest memories is just my dad always working. And I'm talking about working outside the home. So he would do a lot of locuming, and he'd go off for a couple of days here and there to different parts of the country to locum, and he'd always bring gifts back for us and stuff. But he was always very, very hardworking, or always has been very hardworking. But I'd also see a lot of him sitting at the dining table with loads of books around him. He was always studying for something, always studying for an exam, or at least that's how it felt when I was 6, 7, 8, that kind of age. And I think that really did kind of embed that work is a non-negotiable, studying is important, and learning how to work, study, all of that is kind of what helps you to get through life and do the best you can do and get the best jobs and all of that stuff. So I was very kind of cognizant of that. I guess the big thing that happened in my childhood that definitely shaped the rest of our family life and like my life was that when I was 9, my mum had just had my youngest sibling, so child number 4. And I woke up one morning and she had collapsed. So she was 2 weeks postpartum, post-birth, and she'd collapsed and she was like frothing at the mouth and like literally unconscious. And I remember ambulance crew came up and, she was resuscitated. She went to hospital and she was in hospital for ITU, actually, intensive care, for a really long time. And she'd had a really big hemorrhage, brain hemorrhage. And she was in hospital for probably a year and rehab for probably a year, just over a year altogether. So,
Oh God, that's awful.
we were like 11, 9, 7. Yeah, it was a really pretty awful time. And to have young kids. So my brother was 11, I was like 9, and my sister was 7. And then we had the baby as well. And that was like a big turning point for us as a family. I think that's the point where like everything felt like it changed. It was obviously my mum was never the same. She did survive it, but she was disabled for the rest of her life and just never the same mum. Her short-term memory was really kind of shot to pieces, and she was physically disabled and she was never able to work and things. And I think it really just changed the dynamic of our house, and it made me think a lot more about health and longevity and the fact that you can be here one day and then you can be completely changed another. So I always wonder how much of a part that played in my decision to become a doctor in the end, as well as my dad being a doctor. But yeah, that was probably like the defining moment of like my childhood and like a big kind of thing for us as a family.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. That must have been incredibly difficult. And I would imagine it also meant that you had to grow up a lot faster in terms of just being one of the elder siblings, having a baby in the family, not having your mum around to do, I guess, what you'd been used to her doing. I can see how that would be formative as well in terms of potentially plant the seed of going into medicine. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's a really horrible thing to go through as a kid. I guess you went down the path of medicine like your dad and ended up working in the NHS for 8 years. Tell us a bit about how that ended up coming to be, what that experience was like. We all know and love the NHS, but we know it's an intense place to work and is often in the press at the moment being a doctor. So tell us a bit more about your experience and what particularly surprised you in your career as a doctor.
Yeah, sure. So obviously, being at a day school, private school, a lot of people were doing or wanting to study medicine and going into those very kind of vocational careers. So it wasn't out of the way to sort of go down that path. And for me, on reflection, and some people are surprised about this, it just felt like the choice. I don't know how to describe it. There was no other choice that I was more compelled. I wasn't like gunning to be a doctor or anything, but I've been around a doctor my whole life. Medical atmosphere has always been at home, and at an early age, I knew what a locum was and I understood what a general practitioner did and all of these things. So it was more that being someone that can pass exams, and I did the right A-levels, I think I did chemistry and biology and maths, and it just felt like that was the natural progression, I think, more than anything else. So, did the applications, managed to get a spot at King's College London, and off I went. And I was thrilled to be going because I just was desperate to get to a big city at that point and just be a bit more independent and stuff. But I think by the time I was working, I started to have inklings that, I wasn't super, super passionate about this as a career. And I think one thing that is great about medicine is that, I'll never be the person that bashes it as a career because it is such a privilege. It is to be trusted like that by strangers, essentially, with their lives and their families to trust you and their children to trust you. And that is a real privilege for somebody of 24 years old, 25 years old, barely out of short trousers, but you've got all this responsibility. And I think what I did love about medicine is that it always felt really meaningful. Even at the times where I was desperate to leave it, it felt like I was always doing something that was of value, despite being a very, very small cog in a big wheel. And I think I'll always really admire the profession for that, and like the crux of what it is caring for people. And I love that. I think working in the NHS is really hard. It's a very, very hard working environment. And I think we kind of take it for granted because it's just there and so many people work in it. But having worked in other places now, I realize how difficult it is to work in a place where there's so much, it's very archaic. A lot of the systems are completely archaic. I've worked in hospitals where we're still writing on paper during a ward round. Or hospitals where you're pushing a kind of computer around that barely functions without being plugged. Once it's unplugged, it kind of goes dead. It's really difficult in terms of that side of things, but also just the bureaucracy, how much paperwork there is, how fragmented things are, how unconnected everything is. Everything feels very slow and sluggish. And I think that was probably a big part of the frustration I had. I wasn't into tech at that time, but I knew that this just feels so, I can't do this for 40 years. Like this isn't what I want to be doing. I don't want to be always like pushing against the tide, So yeah, I've got like a bit of a love-hate relationship with it, I guess. It's got its plus points, but I think we don't give doctors enough credit for how hard it is really working in that environment and how much of it is run on goodwill, basically.
Totally. No, that really, really resonates with what I've seen in my family. My mum was a hospital chaplain for many years. My sister's a nurse. My sister-in-law is a doctor, and sort of all the wonderful impacts of caring for others. And there's such an impactful role and a real vocation for many. But there's also so many frustrations. And I think what ends up happening is great talent ends up leaving because of that, and that's a real shame. But you've also, as you've proven, there's so much doctors can go on to do and have very successful careers beyond medicine. So tell us a bit about that transition into consulting with BCG. How did you decide that that was the right move to make? And I guess for any doctors listening to this about thinking maybe about their next step in their career, what advice can you give them about figuring out how to make that transition smoother?
I felt very restricted in medicine. I could see the next 10 years exactly what I'd be doing year on year, and I just became a bit disillusioned. So I got to the point where I definitely knew it was time to leave, and I was also very inquisitive about the world outside what is really a bit of a bubble, to be honest. You walk into hospital, it's very much a bubble and you don't know enough about, for me at least, I didn't feel like I was getting the full experience of life in career. So, I wanted to leave, and then it becomes, well, what do you do next? You've got a medical degree and it's a vocation. And at that time, which was actually quite a long time ago now that I was thinking about leaving, it was 10 years ago when I was actually starting to make the transition. It wasn't a big thing to leave. I actually I was very secretive about it all. I didn't tell anybody that I was leaving. I very much kept it to myself. One or two people that I did tell were like not particularly positive about it. Comments like, what about all the time you've wasted? Or what about all the study that you've done? And it just wasn't a thing to leave that kind of environment. And it even took me a while to realize that I could. So, I had to do a lot of, I guess, soul searching, but also actual research on what are the next careers, what do they look like? And I think for anyone that's in that same position, the biggest thing I'd say is to talk to as many people as you can about careers. It sounds very basic, but as a doctor, you only know about medicine for the most part. It might be slightly different now, but at the time, it's like, if you only know about one thing, you need to start to put the feelers out and understand much more about others and figure out what it is that you actually want to do or achieve rather than what the actual career is. So is it that you want to be rich and famous or whatever, figure out what the actual end goals are, what the outputs are you want from a career before actually figuring out the career. And I think the other thing is also just to know what your non-negotiables are. So one of my non-negotiables was that I was not going to go back to studying. I'd just been at uni for 6 years. I had no interest in going back and doing anything else. And some people love it. They want to study more. And I was just like, not for me. So that was anything that required, because I considered law conversion at one point and I kind of ruled it out because I didn't want to do even a year doing any kind of studying. So figuring out those non-negotiables helps. And eventually, my brother, who is 2 years older than me, he was a trader at Goldman Sachs. So he'd gone to LSE and then he'd gone off to become a trader. And then he'd gone off to Boston to business school at MIT. And so he was very much around the consulting realm. And I think he'd done a summer internship at McKinsey. And he said to me, what do you think about consulting? And I was like, well, what's consulting? Like, isn't that just what I'm doing? Medicine, like being a consultant sort of thing. that's the only connection I had with the word consult. And then the more I looked into it, the more I realized that that was actually potentially a good next step. It's a great way to understand more just about lots of different industries and understand more about the commercial world, finance, business, all of those things. So yeah, that's what I did. And then after a number of months of prep, managed to get a position at BCG.
So very impressive. They are very difficult places to get into, and it says a lot about you as a person and how you prepare for those, that you made that transition. And I guess we've seen a lot of our clients, a lot of people that come on this podcast have a grounding in consulting. So it certainly teaches you a lot of, as you say, commercial skills, and that help, often a very good grounding for entrepreneurship. I guess just thinking back to the sort of skills that you had as a doctor and the experience you had, what were the ones that were transferable to BCG? What were the things you really rapidly needed to upskill on? I think just again, for anyone that might be thinking, that's a good path for me.
So the reason why the likes of BCG and McKinsey and Bain love to go looking for doctors and military people and PhDs is because they want people who are able to take a problem, break it into its component parts, figure out how to solve that problem with a strategy that makes sense. It may not be the right strategy in inverted commas, but if you're able to take any issue and kind of figure out a way to create some kind of story on how to solve it, I think that is essentially the crux of consulting, and that's what they want to see. So if you can demonstrate that in your interviews and in the career, then you're in a good position. And I think for me, the transferable skills was that to a degree. As a doctor, you are solving people's problems in some type of way. And of course, I think it's very protocol-led medicine. Something else I disliked about it. It's very like sort of top-down thinking, whereas in consulting, it's the same thing, but it's bottom-up thinking. So you are thinking about solving problems, but you're doing it in a slightly different way. And so that's the shift that I had to make. Beyond that, I think the biggest thing that was a bit of a surprise to me, actually, me personally, was the communication skills. So as a medic at uni, we spent probably about a third of the time on communication, breaking bad news, breaking diagnoses down to people, explaining something, talking to family, a lot of like simulation of those types of discussions. But I never had any inkling that was something that I was particularly good at, or that I was out of the norm, that it was something special that I could communicate particularly well. But when I was at BCG, that was something that would come up a lot. And so, these things you don't necessarily consider to be special skills or skills that you're particularly good at can end up being things that other people from other industries highlight as being really good. So yeah, I think it's just being cognizant of those things and trying to bring those out more.
Yeah, I guess the EQ to deliver difficult news or hard messages, and I guess the influencing skills that you have to have as a medical professional makes total sense. I never really thought of that. You can really see how you can really have an upper hand when it comes to other kind of career consultants from having the experience. And I guess also just having that work ethic and resilience and being able to handle ambiguity as well, I would imagine would be a very powerful transferable experience. I guess many of us had a bit of a pause for thought and career reflection when the pandemic hit, and I know that you did as well. So do you mind sharing a bit more about that time in your life and I guess how the idea for Bloomful was born?
Very strange time for all of us, I think, COVID was, those years. And I remember that in 2020 in particular, one of the things that really stands out in my mind was a lot of discussion about inequality. I don't know if you remember this, but everything from how COVID was affecting people differently, dependent on your background, your race, your age, your location, through to even like George Floyd, Black Lives Matter movement. There was so much discussion about how people are treated in different situations based on what they are. And, I was at home and my son was like 3 at that time, and he was actually the only one I had at that time. And I was also pregnant with my daughter. And I remember doing a lot of deep dive on healthcare inequality, just myself. It was starting to be talked about. So I sort of did a bit of a deep dive there, and maternal morbidity and the inequality that women face when it comes to their chances of dying around childbirth, or their chances of getting on well during the perinatal period based on their race, and all of these things. And I just got really interested in that. And at the same time, people were talking a lot more about menopause. That discussion was becoming much more prevalent. And at the same time, there were women's health startups that were really starting to make a bit of traction. A few here in the UK, but lots in the US. And I think by the time I got to sort of halfway through 2020, and certainly towards the end, I kind of knew that this was a space that I really wanted to make a change in and dive into and work in. And I knew also that I didn't really want to go back to being employed again. I wanted to do something of my own, build something of my for myself, and have a bit more autonomy, essentially. So I guess pulling all of those things together, I ended up having, so my daughter came in October 2020, and literally pretty much straight after she was born, I was like, right, let's do this, let's start thinking about how to pull this together. And yeah, that's kind of where it all came about.
Yeah, amazing. A big call to make, to give up a kind of very lucrative and stable and sought after career like consulting. So how did you know that that idea was going to be, because that's a big risk to take, I guess. So how did you know that it was worth pursuing? Like, what tipped you over the edge there and going, yes, I'm going to go all in on this?
Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, one thing that I didn't expect from consulting was that I was going to miss healthcare. So if you remember me saying that something I love about healthcare is that you are always providing value, and not to bash these consulting firms at all, but I never really felt like I was doing something that was super meaningful like that. And I didn't expect to miss it, but I did. And I knew that I wanted to get back to doing something that was more meaningful. So that's the one thing. But the second thing is to be completely transparent. Like, I was not the super, super high performer at BCG. I was never going to be the person that got made partner and did all those things. Like, I just didn't love it enough to feel like I could do really well and be that, early promotions and that kind of thing. I did what I could, and I definitely felt like it was a great experience. I learned a lot, but I was never going to be the super high flyer at BCG. So it's like, cut your losses. The average tenure there is like 2-3 years. I did my spot, and then I was like, let's do something else.
Before we hear more from today's 40-Minute Mentor, I wanted to tell you about the upcoming Leadership Unleashed open cohorts starting in January. Sign-ups are now open for you to become part of this vibrant new leadership community. You really don't want to miss it. The open cohort is your chance to join a diverse cohort of leaders from different organizations, industries, and parts of the world to build the most critical behaviors and transform into a high performer. This isn't your typical leadership development program where you just show up and listen to lectures. Split into 7 remote workshops, the open cohort follows a coaching-led approach where you'll be actively involved and can turn your learnings into habits in your day-to-day. In fact, here's some feedback from a previous Series B Tech Scale-Up participant. This is no doubt the best leadership course I have ever attended. It feels tailored to me and my own personal working style. I honestly can't recommend this program enough, so if you want to learn more about what to expect or hear from previous learners, get in touch today with the Unleashed team on their email. Say hello at unleashed.company. Now, back to today's 40-Minute Mentor.
And tell us a bit about the early days of building Bloomful. What were your biggest lessons and learnings from getting it off the ground in what is often a exciting but probably pretty daunting, stressful first year in the business?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I felt very kind of, again, privileged to be able to be working in this space. I think there are not enough women or people, who care about women's health. And within that, there aren't enough people that have the kind of clinical understanding and then maybe like the commercial expertise and frankly, the lunacy and grit and support needed to start a business. So, I really acknowledge that I was privileged to be able to even start trying to build that type of business. But that first year was very much, I still consider us to be in the early days. So I don't feel like we're out of the woods yet. But that first year in particular was very much me at my kitchen table, scratching my head, wondering what I'm doing from one day to the next, but also just talking to as many people as possible, whether it be customers, operators in the startup space, investors. This was my first foray into tech and into this startup landscape. And so I needed to sort of network as much as I could and try and understand it as much as I could. And I was literally starting from scratch, building a pitch deck, figuring out how to business models and understanding the market need and all of that. I was trying to learn on the job. So yeah, I think that early time was a really exploratory start to the business and just trying to figure out what kind of solution could really solve this problem. So it was an interesting time. It was also one that required me to just have some resilience and just get on with it and just keep putting one foot in front of the other, I think,
Yeah, no, I can imagine a really exciting and interesting time. I guess the business has been through different iterations. It often does in the early stage of building something. So do you mind sharing a bit more about how it's evolved from the initial concept and sort of what the business actually does today?
Yeah. So the mission has always been to improve and optimize and streamline access to care around women's gynecological health, and specifically for the more chronic conditions. So things like endometriosis, chronic pelvic pain, fibroids, polycystic ovary syndrome, even perimenopause and menopause. These are conditions that affect women over a period of time, often for many years, often have a big impact on women's quality of life and their mental well-being and their ability to work. So that's where we've always stood. How we've tried to solve that problem has definitely varied over the course of the last couple of years. We started off trying to build an online clinic, especially because telemedicine was a big thing around COVID and people were becoming very much used to accessing their clinical care through platforms, online platforms. And so we kind of tried to ride that a little bit, built out all that infrastructure. We found it was good, but we also found it was difficult to get women to pay directly in volume, and we explored other models, but just found that to be a very difficult framework. And then actually that trend almost died down a little bit post-COVID. So we sort of transitioned to building an actual software solution, a triaging app that used conditional logic and AI-driven clinical reasoning to help people to navigate their symptoms towards an actual pre-diagnosis and then of a management plan. We built that out, or at least a prototype, and we had 40,000 people using that prototype. So it was a real success. What we found was that we weren't able to find the organized data sets that are needed to actually validate. And from a regulatory perspective, we couldn't really pursue it onto the next stage, which would have been more of the stage that we could commercialize. So following a lot of customer development, exploration, talking to people, both doctors and patients, that actually evolved into an application that is where we are today. It's a mobile app that delivers digital therapeutic support for women with common gynecological conditions. So women with chronic pelvic pain, for example, we support them with things like pelvic physio, digital CBT, pain psychotherapy, education, dietary advice. We know that anti-inflammatory diet really helps women with endometriosis, for example. All the things that doctors just don't have the time or resource or even knowledge to offer in a clinical setting, but we know that they actually do help those women gain a more holistic kind of management, self-driven management for their treatment. So our app delivers that on a sort of day-by-day basis, dependent on the user and what their needs are. And yeah, we are piloting with a few GP practices, trying to get GPs to actually pay for it on behalf of their patients, because we know that it can actually reduce the amount of face time that patients have with their doctors. So in a nutshell, that's what we do.
A win-win.
That's what we're trying to do.
Oh, brilliant. You can really see the huge opportunity there and the impact that would have for many people's lives. So yeah, excited for that. Best of luck with those pilots. Clearly the business has evolved. You just talked to some of the exciting things that you've been doing, but what have for you been the kind of biggest milestones, the standout moments in the journey? And I guess to counter that, it would be also great to hear from you, what have been the hardest days, the biggest challenges you've had to overcome? Because it's never plain sailing, is it, building a business?
There's been so many, honestly. It's all been a real journey. And I think I've got a book in me about this journey at some point to write. But I think in terms of milestones, the biggest early milestone was getting investment from Google, to be honest. I remember that being a real moment of validation for me. Because at that point, I think I'd been sitting at my kitchen table for about 18 months, trying to figure things out and pull things together and talking to people consistently. And when we opened our pre-seed round, we managed to get some amazing angels, but that was all really kicked off by that investment by Google, equity-free investment from the Black Founders Fund. And I will always be hugely grateful to the team at Google for seeing something in me and Bloomful and really going for it, because we were very, very, very early days at that stage. And I remember the call. They said that, can we have another call? Because there's a few rounds of interview and stuff. And they said, can we have another call? So that we've got a few questions just to round off so that we can go and make the final decision. I got on the call and I'm like, yeah, cool. And in that call, they actually told me that they'd already made the decision and that they were going to be investing. And I just remember bursting into tears. And then after I got off the call, I went into my garden and I literally was running around my garden like a crazy person, jumping up and down. It was just the best feeling ever. And, I called my husband and I was like, you'll never guess what's happened here. And he was really thrilled as well. So that was a really big early milestone. And then, of course, I was able to gather much more angel investment momentum through further angels after that as well and closed the round. So that's been brilliant. But we've had so many other ones. We've won a number of Innovate UK grants, which is great. And most recently, I've won quite a high profile and competitive one as well. I'm embargoed, so I'm not supposed to say, but that's been really great to, again, just get that validation. And of course, it's equity-free funding as well. So those are the big milestones. And then the challenges, where do I start? I think fundraising, I know I said that we were able to close the round, but it was a real slog. It's been a real slog. And I think the economic landscape has not been kind to founders in the last couple of years. And then obviously being a female founder and Black founder, it's hard not to internalize that you do have things stacked against you. But nevertheless, we've always pushed on. I've got very sharp elbows, and this process has taught me how much resilience and grit I actually do have, which is a lot. How to call on that strength to keep going day by day. And it's really hard when you're operating constantly in the unknown, not knowing whether things are going to come together. But I think holding on to that mission and vision, that's probably been the best thing and also the biggest challenge, but that's something that I've always tried to do.
Yeah, and huge kudos to you. It's so hard. It's been a really difficult year for founders to be fundraising. And as you say, the stats are just shocking, and particularly for female founders and for Black founders. And I know there's lots of great people out there trying to change this, and founders like yourself. And this is one of the reasons we really want to share these stories, because there are so many people out there that I think maybe just lose hope when it comes to this, and we really want to change that. What is your advice for anyone listening that might be struggling right now to raise? Have there been any tips that you would give them, or things that have worked for you about your experience when it comes to fundraising?
I'm definitely not an expert when it comes to fundraising, but one thing I will say is, a couple of things. I think firstly is never give up, believe in what you're doing and find the support that you need to keep that resilience going, keep the grit going, and just keep putting one foot in front of the other. So that's just one thing on the mindset. In a practical sense, I've always found that getting good at storytelling is a really big advantage when it comes to fundraising. I think that's something that people don't actually add enough weight to. I wish it was something that they talked about in schools even, because actually when you're a good storyteller, even when, whether you're in tech, whether you're fundraising or not, I feel like you can achieve so much because you can really bring people along and convince people of what you're saying and kind of inspire people to get on board with your mission and your vision, and everything else becomes a lot easier if you can tell a good cohesive story that makes sense. Being able to put that into a pitch deck, being able to put that into your own narrative and your own pitch, I think is something that all founders should really work on. And that's definitely something that I've worked on, and I have found it's been a big catalyst in us securing a number of competitions and winning all sorts of awards and things. Now, if you're able to stand up and really tell a good story, I think people really buy into that. So I think working on that is a big plus point for all founders.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And how have you directly benefited from working with your investors? And do you have plans to raise more on the horizon?
Our investors have been great at allowing us to just get on with it, to be honest. There hasn't been a huge amount of contact in terms of, honestly, it's fantastic. At the same time, I've got a couple of amazing investors who are always at my disposal. And I know that, for example, we've got an event coming up next month because we're releasing a report about women's health in the workplace. And one of my investors has been fantastic at helping us find a venue and helping us find a drink sponsor. So small things like that, they do make a big difference when you're a small startup, but equally you do kind of need the space to just be able to get on with things. And my investors have always been great about not demanding loads of updates every month or every week or whatever, and that just frees up headspace for me to get on with it. So I've not worked with them directly necessarily, but they're always there if I need them, and that's kind of the ideal situation. Yeah,
that's all you can ask for. And I guess coming on to, one of the reasons we fundraise is to invest in the team and sort of help get to the next level with the business. So I know you have quite a lean team, but we all know how important those first hires are. Those early hires, they have such an impact in the business. So what's been your approach to hiring for Bloomful, and how has the business evolved on that front?
I've definitely made a number of mistakes with hiring, but also done some things right. So
haven't we all?
Right. So in terms of mistakes, I think my biggest one early on was hiring for the sake of hiring. I remember in that first year and a half, sitting at the kitchen table, talking to loads of investors, every other conversation would end with, well, where's your technical co-founder? Where's the technical person? And I felt a lot of pressure actually once I closed some angel funding to immediately go out and find this technical person that people had been talking about for so long. And without thinking about it, that's what I did. I guess the problem was that I didn't have a really solid concept of what type of technical person I needed, what actually needed them to build, and really who to find, why, and how. And so I hired someone really quickly. He was a great guy, but I very quickly realized that I didn't need him just yet. We hadn't quite got to the point, we were still using no-code tools, and we could still get a lot of mileage out of those no-code tools. So I was paying this person a full-time rate for not doing much. So that was a big lesson to me, and I actually did let him go during his probation, which was not ideal and I felt rubbish about. And that was a big learning curve for me, which is just to really understand who you need and why, and go out with purpose to find somebody that fits that bill. But equally, on the plus side, I think I've done some things right. So one of my most long-standing hires is our operations lead, and I met her through just networking, and all of the conversations I had in that first year or so really came together in us meeting. We were probably like 4 or 5 degrees of separation from each other. So an intro to an intro to an intro to an intro. But she's turned out to be just an absolute godsend for Bloomful. She's somebody that can do a bit of everything. I wasn't particularly kind of welded to an actual position when I was hiring her. It was more of like gut instinct. And that's turned out to be a fantastic move. So I think networking is a really underplayed or underestimated way of finding the right person.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. It's amazing how sometimes those early hires can come about in ways like that and have such an impact. So that's great to hear. How would you describe the culture that you're building at Bloomful, and what is your vision for the business and the team as you kind of look forward to 2025?
I describe us as very open, friendly culture, fairly flat structure. We're all hands on deck, very collaborative. We definitely value diversity of ideas, of thoughts, of opinions, and that's something that's very important to me, for sure. I think as we go forward, we've got plans to raise some capital. We've got some grants coming through, so that's great. And then we need to use some of that grant money to hire. So that's going to be our priority for 2025. But I'm very, very welded to the idea of keeping things as lean as possible. I'm very kind of cautious when it comes to that. Striking the balance between hiring a team that's big enough to sort of keep going and hit the ground running and move fairly quickly, but also not over hiring, because I've seen that mistake a lot. My brother after business school went off to build his own startup, which has been hugely successful. But they've had to cut a lot of people for a number of different reasons, and I know that that's been difficult. So I think just being super cautious on that front is something that I'm always very cognizant of.
Yeah, it's really sage advice. Even though it's ironic that I'm a headhunter, I've made these same mistakes again, overhiring, trying to do too much, having to then suffer the consequences and have those difficult conversations. So it's really important for anyone listening to this that might be getting a little overexcited. Just be cautious on that front for sure. You have done a wonderful job of building your personal brand on LinkedIn. Ever since we first met at an event, I've seen the content you produced. It's really compelling and I really love it. So I guess I just wanted to ask, taking the conversation in a slightly different direction, why did you decide to start creating content on LinkedIn? And what results or benefit have you seen from doing that?
I remember earlier this year just having this sense that I was leaving things on the table by not sharing more. I've always been quite introverted and not somebody that likes to put my head above the parapet on social media and say a lot about what's going on. I'm very much like a undersell, over deliver type of person. And so I was never the person to post on LinkedIn. I have an Instagram account that I've never posted on. I'm not on Twitter, I'm not on Facebook. So I'm very low key on that front. But I was always very aware that I know that these platforms can bring you opportunity if you do kind of dare to venture on them and use them. So I guess I just got to the point where I was like, do you know what, let me just try it and see how it goes. And it took a lot of psychological shift for me to even start posting on LinkedIn. But eventually back in, I think, March or April, I started posting just a couple of times a week just to sort of test it out and see how it went. And it was like fairly well received. I felt I was gathering a little bit of a very small following at that stage. I think I'm talking about 2,000 followers or something, 3,000 followers. But people were appreciative of the messages that I was giving out. And I was sharing the update on Bloomful, but also tips on how I've won grants and things like that. But it got to the point where I just wanted to take it a step further, and I'm too type A for my own good. And I wanted to, if I'm going to do this, let's do it properly. So a few months later, I just decided that I wanted to go all in on it, really. And I think the main reason was I wanted to build an asset for myself, which would have two kind of channels. One would be that it could give me an outsized leverage or return for my business in terms of, partnership opportunities and leads, but also just be a standalone asset for myself as well, so that no matter what happens, I've always got that audience and that personal brand to lean on. And just to show that I'm more than just Bloomful, there's a lot more to me. I love talking about personal growth. I love, I'm a keynote speaker, I'm a mother. I want to be able to talk about different facets outside of women's health and outside of what I do on a day-to-day. So altogether, it's just given me the opportunity and the platform to do that. And I think the returns have been great. Firstly, my writing has improved, which is not something that you really think about, but I look at my writing now compared to before, and I feel much more confident in being able to write. But secondly, I've had a couple of great leads for Bloomful. I've massively increased my network, and that's led to lots of paid speaking opportunities, key podcast opportunities, and just the chance to get my face out there. And I'm starting to now get the odd sponsorship request as well. Haven't taken any up yet, but it's nice to know that people are thinking about building that kind of relationship. And even people asking me to help them on LinkedIn and coach them on LinkedIn, it's just not something that ever really it's not the reason why I started. It's not something that really ever came into my mind, but organically, these are the things that happen when people see more of you. And I think everybody should be building their personal brand to a degree in some format. It doesn't have to be on LinkedIn, could be on another platform, but it really does return a lot. If you're able to put the time and effort in, I think it does return a lot more than what you put in.
Couldn't agree more. And if there was one or two tips for anyone that's inspired by what you just said to go out and build their brand, what would those be? Particularly when we're thinking about LinkedIn, which is probably the channel that I use most, and a lot of people listening to this will use.
Yeah, I think one thing is to really just decide how deep you want to get into it. I think LinkedIn can be a bit of a vault. I've learned these last few months, you can be quite surface level with it, or you can really immerse yourself in it. Now, of course, the more you put in, I do think the more you get out. But I think if you can answer that question, that will help you to decide whether it's just get started, put a post out there and see how it goes, or whether it's, I need to go and get coaching. I want to get really good at this. I want to learn about all the different formats of posting, and I really want to optimize for follower growth or whatever it is. So there's a bit of a spectrum there. And I think knowing where you sit on that spectrum will help you decide what you want to do first. But yeah, I'd implore everyone to explore it and get started in some way for sure.
Great advice. We're sadly, and then Dupe, we've got two final wrap-up questions for you. This is 40-Minute Mentor. So if you could be mentored by anyone, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
That's such a good question. I would choose Michelle Obama. Crazy, I know, but she is somebody that I have always admired. And then when I watched her documentary a few years ago, Becoming, I was just really struck by how smart she is, how sincere, how warm, very intelligent, really diplomatic. Feels like somebody that has an answer or an experience for everything. And I just really like her vibe. And so I'd love to have a sit down dinner date with her and just pick her brains on anything and everything, including what it was like to live in the White House.
Yeah, I would love to have Michelle Obama on the podcast to do all those things. I'd say she's probably one of the most requested dream mentors. So yeah, really. Just such a amazing leader and speaker, and it's just I would absolutely love that. So Michelle, if you're listening, come mentor Dupe and come on the podcast,
please.
Yes, please. And finally, what is one piece of career advice that you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
I would say, if you can, stay as far away from your comfort zone as possible. I think that doing things that scare you and doing things that feel just a little bit uncomfortable, whether it be changing careers, whether it be starting a side hustle, even if it's giving a talk, I think when you're too comfortable, it's very easy to stagnate. And if you're not learning something new every day, even if it's the smallest thing, I think, you can start to almost become stationary. So I think my biggest bit of career advice is to find ways to push yourself out of the limits of what you feel comfortable with, even if it's slightly. And the more you do that, the more comfortable you get with that limit. And then you can push a little bit further and a little bit further. And before you know it, you've essentially grown a lot in a sort of personal and professional development sense.
What a wonderful piece of advice to end this. I couldn't agree more. I think we all have so much more we can achieve. And sometimes it's just about pushing ourselves, getting more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And it's amazing what we can achieve as a result. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being such a wonderful guest. Wishing you and Bloomful nothing but success over the years ahead. And yeah, I'm sure we'll get you back on for a round 2 in a few years. And yeah, very excited to see where the business is then. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I'd love that. And thank you for having me. It's been great.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I really hope that you found it useful and inspiring. If we have left any questions unanswered, or if you have any feedback or guest recommendations for future series, then please make sure you get in touch on info@jbmc.co.uk. I often get asked by listeners how you can help us spread the word about 40 Minute Mentor. There are 2 simple ways you can help. Firstly, share this episode on your preferred social media platform, and LinkedIn is probably where I'm most likely to see it. And you can also leave us a review on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Every share on social media and review left on the podcast platforms really helps us to get 40 Minute Mentor in front of new audiences and share the power of mentorship even further. Thank you so much for your ongoing support, and I look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday for even more pocket-sized mentorship.